The space race began in 1957 when the Soviets launched the satellite Sputnik 1 into orbit. The United States responded by speeding up its own space program.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
On May 25, 1961, John F. Kennedy announced that he wanted to land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. But before we get into this, let's rewind back in time. In 1957, the Soviets launched the first ever artificial satellite into space called the Sputnik 1. This success by the Soviets caused great alarm in the United States. No more than a few years later, the United States put their own satellite into orbit called the Explorer 1. Over the next few years, the Soviets and the United States put many more satellites into space. Later, in 1958, the United States established a government agency in charge of its space program called the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. Brought together the talent of many scientists and engineers who worked together to solve the many difficult technical problems of space flight. The first living creature sent into space was a dog named Laika. She orbited Earth aboard the Soviet spacecraft Sputnik 2 in November of 1957. But sadly, on her fourth orbit, her cabin overheated, causing her to die. And in October of 2002, her death was revealed to the public. Only a few years after Laika, the space race heated up even more, and the Soviets launched the first human into space. His name? Yuri Gagarin. At the age of only 27, he aborted Vostok 1 and launched into space. And about 89 minutes later, his spaceship landed and he returned to Earth safely. No less than a month later, after Vostok 1's success, an American astronaut by the name of Alan Shepard aborted his tiny spacecraft called Freedom 7. Alan Shepard was the first ever American astronaut to be in space. Just a year later, the first American to orbit Earth was John Glenn, who was launched into space in 1962 aboard Friendship 7. The spacecraft he traveled in was called a space capsule because it was like a small cap on the end of the rocket. The tiny capsule orbited Earth 3 times before returning to the surface. These last two spaceships, called the Freedom 7 and Friendship 7, were part of the Mercury program. The mission of the Mercury program was to put a person into orbit of Earth and land them back safely on the ground. In JFK's speech, he said that this nation should commit itself to achieving a goal before the decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning them safely to Earth. With these words, he launched a space program called the Apollo Space Program, which eventually led to the 1969 Apollo moon landing. Between 1964 and 1972, the United States and the Soviets sent many unpiloted spacecraft to explore the moon. When a U.S. spacecraft called Surveyor landed on the moon, it did not sink into the surface. This proved that the moon had a solid surface. Next, scientists searched for a place to land humans on the moon. In July of 1969, 3 American astronauts circled the moon aboard Apollo 11. Once in orbit, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin entered a tiny spacecraft called Eagle. On July 20th, the Eagle descended toward a flat area on the moon's surface called the Sea of Tranquility. When Armstrong radioed that the Eagle had landed, cheers rang out at NASA Space Center in Houston. A few hours later, Armstrong and Aldrin left the Eagle to explore the moon. When Armstrong first set foot on the moon, he said, "That's one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind."
It's a little shadowy, but he said he expected that in the shadow of the lunar module. Armstrong is on the moon. Neil Armstrong, 38-year-old American, standing on the surface of the moon. On this July 20th, 1969.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
After they landed on the moon, Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong looked on the moon's surface, collecting samples to take back to the Earth. They also planted an American flag of their remembrance of being on the moon. Over the next 3 years, 5 more Apollo missions landed on the moon. In these later missions, astronauts were able to stay on the moon for days instead of hours. Some astronauts even used lunar rover or buggy to explore larger areas of the moon. The astronauts collected nearly 400 kilograms of lunar samples called moon rocks. When scientists analyzed these samples, they learned a great deal about the moon. They learned that the materials that make up the moon rocks are the same materials that are found on Earth. However, in some moon rocks, these materials combine to form kinds of rocks that are not found on Earth. Scientists were able to calculate the ages of the moon rocks. With that information, they could better estimate when different parts of the moon surface formed. The space race helped us create many things, but I think the most important one is the International Space Station, which is a space station that provides a place where long-term experiments can be carried out in space. In the 1980s, the United States and 15 other countries began planning the construction of the International Space Station. The first module or section of the station was placed in orbit in 1998. Since then, many other modules have been added on board. Astronauts and scientists from many countries are already carrying out experiments in various fields of science. They are learning a lot more about how humans adapt in space. That was my presentation about how the space race broke the barrier of space exploration. And I think without the space race, we would not be where we are today.